Hi everybody, thanks for joining me. This is Nick again from Creation Army TV. It's been a while since I did a tutorial, but here goes. This is my first Cinema 4D tutorial, and it's based on an animation which I made a couple of months ago called Decoding a Virus. And a lot of people have asked me how I actually made this virus. So here's how I actually made the first virus that you see in the animation. Along the line, if I scrub through here, we can start seeing the second virus. Both of these are made using Cinema 4D. And I'll walk you through the basics of how I made this virus. So if we look at this virus, what do we have? We have this sort of pinkish nucleus, and then we have this blackish reddish shell that goes around the outside of it, and then we have the tentacles coming off. So it's basically made of two spheres and then a pyramid. All right, and now this whole thing is based off just basically going to Google Images and searching for virus. There are many forms of viruses, and there's many different images of viruses. Some of them are computer generated simulations like this one. Some of them are just drawings like this, which we know from our high school textbooks. Some of them are advanced computer renderings like this that actually sort of look like electron microscope images of viruses. And this is what I was going for originally when I made the virus. So how do we pull this kind of thing off? Pretty easily. Here's how we do it. Again, we're going to be looking at two spheres. One is the nucleus, one is the outer shell, and then the last object we'll make is a pyramid, which will turn into these tentacles. And forgive me, I don't know the biological terms of besides nucleus. I don't know anything else, but bear with me. So I'm going to jump right into Cinema. And this, by the way, is hooked into my, this is Cinema 4D Lite. It's hooked into my copy of After Effects. The whole thing was composited in After Effects, so later on you'll be able to see the final animation. And so within Cinema 4D, first thing we're going to do is go up to the shape layer and pull out a sphere. And this will be our nucleus. Right off the bat, you can start seeing that it has these sort of flat edges. It renders perfect. But we want this to be subdivided. Notice how I choose sphere. I'm going to type nucleus. I like to name my object as much as possible. I'm going to click on nucleus, and in the objects tab, we have 24 segments. That's why we can see these flat spots. It's important that you, first of all, size it down maybe about to 20 centimeters. And I'm just rolling the mouse wheel up, by the way, to get closer to the object. It's important that you give it more segments as it goes around. If I hit C and make this object editable on the keyboard, and hit the nodes tab, now we can see that it's made up of this low number of polygons. So I won't be able to pull off this nice undulating displacement later on. So it's important that you take this nucleus and give it lots of segments. You can do 100, I don't know what kind of machine you're working on, so the more segments you do, the harder it's going to be for your computer to render it. It's going to take more render time. I'm going to do 150 for now. Don't go crazy with like 15,000 or anything. But now, if I just quickly hit C on the keyboard, now you can see that it's made up of a lot more points. And so that's going to give us smoother texture later on. I'll hit undo. I'm not actually going to work with an editable object just yet. So here's our nucleus. So how do we start making it look like this nucleus right here? Notice what's going on with this nucleus, and for that matter, with the original image from Google Images. The parts of the object that are facing the camera, where my mouse is right now, are dark in color, and the areas that start to face away or recede from camera are lighter. How do we pull that off? We can pull that off basically with the luminance value of a material. So let's start to make a material. I'm going to double click in the materials area or hit create new material. So I'll create a new material by double clicking, and I'll double click on the material to bring up the options panel, and I'll drag that right onto the nucleus object so that it takes effect. You can give it a name right here. I like to give everything a distinct name, and I don't want it to have color. I actually just want it to have luminance and no reflectance just yet. So you've checked luminance on, and we just see this sort of white coloring. If we render, we just get this white sphere, and this is not correct yet. So how do we change this? Do we change this color to red? Well, no, you're just coating, sort of coating the entire thing with this red luminance. And we don't want that. Again, we want the object to be basically dark in the areas that are facing camera. So how do we do that? We hit texture. We bring this little flyout down and choose Fresnel. Fresnel is going to give us a nice gradation on the object on areas that are facing camera. So right away we see this sort of this gradient right here, and the top of the gradient represents not the inside of the object, but something that is facing camera. So let's edit that, because around the outsides, where the white is right here, I want it to be a reddish color. And near the inside, I want it to be dark red, maybe not necessarily black. You can choose whatever you want at this point. Again, the example on the internet is green. I'm just choosing red because I want to show you how I made this one. So you can choose red, or you can lean it towards this area of the spectrum if you want to. And if we hit render, now we get this object right here. So it's starting to look right. Now if you move these knots anywhere, you'll actually move the color on the outside closer to the center. I leave that totally up to you. You can also move the center divider to change the sharpness of the gradient. So I'll just leave that there. The next thing that I like to do is affect the transparency a little bit. It's very subtle in this video, but you can the nucleus does have a little bit of transparency. So we want to be able to see through it, to see through the nucleus, but not too much. First thing I'm going to do, just for demonstration purposes, I'll add a floor. And I'll actually just move the floor downward so that we can start to see through the object. I'll add a new material. This material will just be the floor. Bear with me for a second. And I'm going to, on the colors panel, I'm going to actually add a surface checkerboard and make this just gray and shrink it down to 100 so that we can, sort of like the Photoshop what is it, transparency grid. So if I hit render now, now we can see a floor. So back to what I was saying about this nucleus material is we do want to see through it a little bit. If I hit transparency, I actually check this on. Here's what's happening. This white color right here is coating the entire object with transparency. That means, basically what I mean by that is this white value is turning on transparency, sort of like masking in Photoshop. But again, if I come to the texture tab and add a Fresnel, now what we get in the little preview window up here is we can see that it's transparent around the outsides and opaque near the center. But I actually want to reverse that. I want it to be transparent in the area that is facing camera, but opaque around the areas that are facing away from camera. So you can just right click on the gradient and hit invert knots. What these colors, by the way, represent is area, the one on the left represents facing camera. So with black selected, we'll get some transparency, and with white on the outside, we'll get opacity. We'll get complete opacity. So this is a little preview of the nucleus with a little bit, with a lot of transparency added. But I want it to be more subtle. So I'm going to take this white color, which is in the inside, and I'll bring the color down to a darkish gray. So now it's less transparent than it was before. Let's actually zoom in. I'm going to turn on interactive render so that we can see a preview as we work. And you can see down here that we can actually see through it a little bit. So I'm not going to worry too much about the transparency for the moment. I just want to move on and show you how we can actually start to get some of this undulation around the outside. And we're going to do that with this tab right here called displacement. I'll check it on and you'll see that nothing happens. And that's because there is no texture applied to the displacement map. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just add noise. I usually just add a noise. You can add whatever you want. Fresnel's not going to do very much for you here. But in this case, I just want noise. That's what this is right here. Sort of looks like the surface of water. And if I click through one frame at a time here, you can actually see that it moves through time. So it actually evolves. All right. So I'm going to, on the texture tab, choose noise, and then we get a little preview of it here. Notice that strength and height just became ungrayed, and now they're actually active, but nothing happened on our object. Here's what's happening. Here's this strength, I'm gonna leave it 100%, and the height of our displacement, which is set on intensity centered, means that the displacement map is now pushing the object, areas of the object, like this preview right here, inside 5 centimeters and out 5 centimeters. If you change this to any other number, let's say 2 centimeters, then the displacement will happen to push the object in and out 2 centimeters. But why do we have basically nothing happening as far as displacement's going right now on the object? You can turn it on and you can turn it off, and you can see right away in this live render that nothing is really happening, even though it is in our preview panel. That's because the noise that I've applied to this object is way too large. So I'll click on the thumbnail to come in, and you'll see this panel. This allows you to edit the noise. You come down to your global scale, and this was what I was telling you about a minute ago. It's way too large. It's 100%. So I'm going to bring this down maybe to like 20%. And, oh, forgive me. The reason that we're not seeing any displacement on this object is because it is still a live sphere. I haven't made the sphere editable. That was my mistake. So to do that, just click on the object and hit the letter C on your keyboard, or this button right here is make editable. So if you hit C, there. Now we have an object that, let me turn displacement off. Remember when I hit this button earlier, let me turn off interactive render, and we could see the actual segments that made up the nucleus. Now it's an editable object. It's no longer considered a sphere, even though it looks like a sphere. So let's turn displacement back on. And remember, when I hit global scale before, I put it at 20. Let me turn interactive render back on. You won't see any of the displacement until you turn on render, until you hit Shift R or Control R, Command R, which is a full screen render, or use interactive render. I like to use this as I go so that I can see my changes take place immediately. So now we can see our actual displacement. And I brought down the global scale. Here's how it looked at 100%. Basically, by default, it gives you this sort of blob. All right, that means the displacement map is actually very large. So let's bring this down maybe like 30. I'm sort of guessing. 30 looks good. I want to do 40 maybe. And down here at the bottom, sometimes I like to decrease the contrast. You'll see a change here in the noise, and you'll notice that that'll give you a slightly more subtle look. Let's bring the noise up a little bit. And the nice thing about our luminance channel is that in the areas that are facing camera, we got this nice dark color. In the areas that are facing away from camera, like this edge right here, and all the way around the outside, we get that nice red color. So we're sort of simulating the electron microscope look. And you can do that on, red blood cells too. Notice how the color lightens as it goes toward the outside. It can be done with diffusion as well. But we're just talking about luminance here. All right, so again in the displacement tab, if you click it anytime you come back to the main panel, I'm going to click on the noise again. You don't have to use regular noise, that's just a default. If you click this little triangle by the word noise, you can choose from a whole bunch of different ones. There's actually a cubic one, which, I don't know, maybe you're trying to build a futuristic robotic ball or the Death Star or something. So that'll give you some good pixelated noise. I like to use for this virus, I want to use sparse convolution because I found it to be a little bit smoother. It's not different from just regular noise. I invite you to experiment with different noise. This one gives you a nice craggy look, displaced Voronoi. I'm going to go again with sparse convolution and just leave it where it is. So I'm pretty happy with my nucleus so far, and this is still pretty highly editable. If I want to come back and change anything about it, I can. You can also, if you want to, add a little bit of reflectance. Notice that back in our video, it is a little bit shiny around the outsides. So you can do that if you want to. Let's go to default specular and make that a little bit narrower. That'll make my nucleus make the shine a little bit sharper, and we can bring up the amount a little bit so it looks a little glassy. And then of course you can make the color of the reflection itself a different color, something to match the object. So if we bring up the fall off a little bit. Anyway, I leave that up to you to experiment. So I'll close this panel for now. And now we're ready to make our shell. I'm going to turn off interactive render. We've made our nucleus, like this video. And now I want to build my shell. Now my shell is transparent. I can see the nucleus inside it. And it's dark around the outsides. And then it's got this maroon color as it faces toward camera. It's very transparent though, right? So what I'm going to do is actually just duplicate the nucleus, and I'll rename the object to shell. The nucleus itself is 40 centimeters. I want my shell to be maybe about 55 centimeters. So it's a little bit larger. And if we render, you can see that it sort of looks like that. But I want it to have a different quality from the nucleus. So just like I duplicated the nucleus before by clicking and dragging, holding Command, you can duplicate materials the same way. So I'll take the nucleus material and I'll duplicate it by clicking, dragging, and holding Command or Control if you're on PC. And I'll double click this new material and call it shell. And right away I'm going to click and drag right onto this material to replace it. Okay. And I'm going to turn on interactive render once again so that we can get a nice preview of what I'm doing as I work. Let's take off the reflectance, let's take off the displacement, and let's just concentrate on the luminance. Remember the earlier luminance had this sort of raspberry color. I'm going to replace that with something that's more black like this. So around the outsides of the shape, which is this red color, I want it to be basically black, very close to black, reddish black. And around the part that faces camera, I want it to be, let's say, reddish. There we go. So that's how the shell is starting to look, but notice that we can't see through it quite yet. So come over to your transparency panel and activate it. And from before, because I duplicated it, the Fresnel is actually there already, and you can actually see through it a tiny bit here where my mouse is. You can start to see the nucleus on the inside. But we want to see far more. We want it to be very transparent. So I'll come over and I'll edit the Fresnel by clicking on the gradient and making the color facing the camera a little bit closer to white. And so now you can see in the little preview window here that we can start to see through it. I'll go a tiny bit brighter. And I'll actually drag the gradient knot a little bit more towards the inside and make this a little bit sharper. Okay, experiment with that to your heart's content. And now we're going to add a little bit of the displacement. So I'll turn this layer back on, this effect, displacement, right back on. And there we go. We've got our nice 2 centimeter intense noise displacement. One thing that I forgot to mention is animation of displacement. Let's jump back to the nucleus and edit the displacement noise. If you come down to this, in this panel, if you come down to animation speed, by default it'll be on 0. And remember, as we click through this animation, we can see that the noise is actually evolving and changing. So the shape looks like it's moving and morphing. So if you change this animation speed, say to 1, then the noise will start to move, and it will actually loop over and over. The higher that number is, say 10, the faster it'll go. I'm going to leave it at 1 right now, and I'm going to go back to the shell material, to the displacement tab, click on displacement, and I'm going to raise the animation to maybe 0.75. In other words, I want the nucleus to animate quicker than the shell. I don't want the shell to move too much. Really, the life of the virus is right here in the nucleus, so I want that to look alive and morphing. Okay, and again, very easy to change later on. So I've made my shell, I've made my nucleus, and now it's time to start to make one of these tentacles. I'm just going to make one tentacle, and I'm going to let Cinema 4D clone it for me using the array. And I'm going to show you how I did that just now, right now. I'm going to turn off interactive render. I'm also going to turn off the floor. I don't need to see the floor anymore. And I'll just zoom out a little bit. Because to make one of these tentacles, what I need to start with is a cone. So if you hit cone, right away you're going to see this enormous cone that is much, much larger than my nucleus. And I don't want it to be that big. So if you grab this little tiny yellow dot right here, you can move it in and you'll actually change the radius. Notice in the properties panel that this is your bottom radius. So you can make that nice and small if you want to. I'm going to move, using E on the keyboard, I'm going to move this object up so that the center is sort of coming out. Or sorry, so that the bottom of the tentacle is coming out from the nucleus. Like it's an octopus arm or something like that. I'm going to make the tentacle a little bit shorter by dragging the top down, and then I'll move the whole thing back down a little bit. Alright, the next important thing is to make sure that the cone is subdivided. You want a good number of subdivisions because what we're actually going to do is apply a sort of flag wind effect so that this is waving and moving around like it does in this animation. You can see that the tentacles are sort of moving and evolving by themselves. It's very subtle. So, come over to your cone and right here where it says height segments, this is how many segments go up and down the height of the cone. You need to increase that to maybe 100. And as far as rotation segments go, which are the segments that go around like this, you can probably leave that at maybe 75. So now, the next thing you want to do is use one of these effects in blue or in purple, and I'm going to use wind. And what wind is going to do, you can see the effect down here. What wind is going to do is, right now it does nothing because it's not grouped with the cone. But wind is going to make this object sort of act like it's a flag, like it's a flag on a pole. And it's going to give it this nice curvy, wavy distortion. So to activate it, take wind and hold shift and select the cone and group them together. I'm right clicking and I'm choosing group objects. And I'm going to give this object a name, tentacle. Okay, and right away we can see that this looks bizarre. It looks more like a helicopter blade or a shark's fin or something like that. It's not looking wavy like it did in the original animation. That's because the wind is oriented left and right now. What I have to do is select it, and then I have to turn it. I think if you turn it along the z-axis 90 degrees, you should get something that's a little bit more like what you're looking for. But this tentacle is not complete. I'm not done. All right. Again, let me mention that the reason I'm getting this nice smooth shape is because my cone is subdivided with segments. So if your cone at this point does not look like this, and it looks more like this, where it's, you know, angled, and it renders really weird, then you need to increase your height segments. Again, I'm just going for 100. So why is it just making this one curve? Well, my wind effect, you can see in the object panel here, in the properties panel of wind, the size is very large. The size is about 100 centimeters. So I'm going to bring the size down, and you can start to see that how it affects the tentacle. So I'm going to bring it down to maybe about 25. But this tentacle is highly distorted. I mean, you can see in space that it's definitely not the way we want it to look. So that's because the amplitude is too high. It's at 50 centimeters. So let's bring the amplitude down to something a little bit more manageable, like this. Maybe about 5 centimeters. So now the amplitude of distortion is only 5 centimeters. And that's fine. If you change frequency, I believe it changes the speed later on. I'm going to drag the little green CTI here through the timeline, and you can see how this animates. Wind automatically animates by itself. You don't have to set any keyframes. But if you change the frequency, I believe it speeds it up. All right, so I put that at 5. I'll just leave it where it is. So we have a nice moving tentacle now, okay, that is going right into the nucleus. But you'll notice that it's not really animated in 3D. It's sort of, you can see the distortion here on this side, but once we face it this way, it's sort of like a pirate's, hook hand. It's two-dimensional. So how do we solve that? Wind, unfortunately, it cannot really animate in 3D like the way I'm talking about right now. I'd love to have some side-to-side distortion here, too. But one wind effect can't do that. You have to add a second. So I'll click and drag on it, and I'll hold Command, and I'll duplicate it. So this, I'm going to name wind number 2. And with this second wind effect, it sort of just strengthens the first one. But if you hit R on the keyboard and rotate it along this axis, now you're actually going to give yourself, maybe with some random values, now you're going to give yourself this sort of different wind effect that will give you a 3-dimensional distortion. You can rotate it and change it to your heart's content. Now you have something, notice as I orbit around the object, now you have something that is animated and distorted in 3 dimensions, all 3 dimensions. So no matter which direction we're looking at this, it's corkscrewed, it's whipping through the wind, and it's nice and smooth. Now we have 2 effects on this. So it's borderline random, although it's not random. All right, next thing is to give this tentacle a material, because we don't want it to be this gray, of course. So I'll just zoom way in. I'll turn on interactive render, and let's go to the original and have a look at how it's supposed to look. So I've got this sort of dark tentacle here, and near the outsides or parts of the tentacle object that face away from the camera starts to turn this red color. So again, we're going to make a new material, call it tentacle. I'll drag it onto the object group, not to the cone itself, but onto the entire group. I'll move this to the side. We're going to turn off color. We're going to turn off reflectance, and we'll just give it luminance. Again, I'm going to use Fresnel for the texture. And notice around the outside it's white. I'll click on the Fresnel gradient, and I'll use a red color. Now it's starting to look eerie. Now it's starting to look like the real thing. I'm going to edit my gradient knots a little bit so that towards the inside of the object, or parts of the object that are facing the camera, they're black. Next thing is to give it a little bit of texture. We can see around the outsides here that it's got sort of this tree bark texture. Now this is not going to be easy to do since we've got kind of a small object, but I'm going to use displacement. I'll click this check mark, and I'll use noise. And you'll see right away that it's the displacement noise itself is far too large. First of all, I only want it to be about 1 centimeter, the displacement itself. Then I'll click on the displacement. Again, I'll use sparse. And maybe not sparse this time. Maybe I'll use something a little bit chunkier. Poxo is pretty good. Sometimes I like to use FBM. We'll use this one because that looks a little bit more like the tree bark in the original animation. You can increase contrast if you want to, and that'll get you a little bit harder displacement. And I'm going to bring down the global scale by about half. Actually, maybe to 20%. There we go. Now we're getting a nice texture. And I'm going to bring down the contrast a tiny bit more until we get something we like. Experiment with this as much as you want. It's fun to make these textures, and again, because of that nice luminance property, at any angle you see the red only on the sort of outside perimeter of the object. So let's go and close this, and now let's clone the tentacle so that we have a few copies going around the outside of the nucleus. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole tentacle group, I'll select it in my panel here, my layers panel, my objects panel. I'm going to hold Option, and I'll come up to this green panel here and click on the array. What that's going to do, the shortcut I did there, just basically automatically places the object into the array. You don't have to do that. You can always just click array and then drag your tentacle into it manually if you want to. Alright, so what's going on here? Well, by default, array is going to push my copies, my 7 copies of my object out 250 centimeters. And of course now it sort of looks like this virus Stonehenge, but that's not what I want. I want every one of these tentacles to be joined to the center of the nucleus. So how do we do that? Let's take array by clicking on it in the objects panel. And of course I want to bring the radius way down to maybe 5 centimeters. And it's giving us this weird sort of spirally, I don't know, maybe that's something you want to do, maybe in another project. Put in your mental Rolodex so that maybe you want to build a virus that sort of looks like this. You know, if we do a render of that, we get this cool looking virus that maybe it swims, you know, and those are its legs. If we go through time, you can see that it sort of evolves like this. So, you know, maybe you can make a nice little like jellyfish or something, but this is not what I'm aiming for in this tutorial. What I want to do is show you how the array works to make these sort of helicopter blade like tentacles. Okay, so with our array selected, we have 7 copies. You can change the number of copies if you want to, just so it's maybe only a handful. And I'm just going to leave it on 7. I want to turn my tentacle so that it's facing out like a helicopter blade. So if I click on tentacle in the group in the objects panel and hit R and rotate it, nothing happens. And why is that? It can be a little frustrating if you don't know cinema. You have to come to axis, enable axis editing mode. Basically, this is like in After Effects where you're going to edit the anchor point of your object. You can move the anchor point all the way around wherever you want to, and you'll notice that your object doesn't move. So if we come to enable axis, or L on the keyboard, and then rotate, now you'll notice that the object actually rotates, and the array updates the modification that you're doing. So I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees so they're facing out, and I'm going to move with the E key. Hitting E on the keyboard, I'm going to move the tentacles. So now I'm going to just move it down like this, and there we go. Now we've got our sort of helicopter blade tentacles. Alright, I'll hit L to come out of axis mode, and I'm going to move the entire array with the E key, and I'll move the entire array down so that it intersects with the virus nucleus. And there you go. One virus made pretty quickly, and here's a nice render. Let's do a full screen render. What I'm going to do now is bring this into After Effects so that you guys can see the finished product. Thanks for joining me in this quick tutorial. I'm Nick with Creation Army. Stick around, I've got a lot more to show you in future tutorials. Take care.